All right. So I think I'm going to ask everybody to mute, or maybe I can mute everybody myself. Um, and I'll get started. And as you can see, and as is always the case, feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand, whatever you need to do in order to be able to ask a question whenever you want. I'm going to depart from what we've been doing really for a couple of months now, which is speaking fairly exclusively about domestic politics and especially about the election. I will say a little bit about that today, but I'm going to concentrate on what's happening in the Middle East, in particular with the growing conflict between Israel and Lebanon and Iran, and the question of the humanitarian impact of now widening war. I'll share with you some of the data that's an overly sanitized way to put it, some of the information about the casualties, which is truly awful. We're seeing the highest levels of women and children killed in any war in the world in the last 20 years in the conflict in Gaza. And I don't think there's any reason to expect that if the conflict spreads into southern Lebanon, there would be differential levels of caution in terms of avoiding civilian casualties. And at the same time, recognizing that this is one of the most volatile regions of the world, one of the most heavily armed regions of the world, regimes that are fragile and frequently propelled into conflicts they may not want to engage in due to the fragility of the regime. That in all these respects, this is something that I think we should be deeply concerned about. And I will mention as we get a little bit deeper into it, it's not as if it doesn't have implications for our domestic politics, but we should be concerned about it intrinsically as people who are concerned about human life, as people who are concerned about war, about regional stability, about the global impact of a potential conflict in the Middle East. And so in the title, I refer both to a broader war, which really refers to the image on the right, which is the image of the Iranian ballistic missiles falling on a suburb of Tel Aviv, targeting the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency headquarters. And that is, we will have to see something that Israel will almost certainly respond to. Will it respond in a way that further escalates this war? And to be as clear as possible, this will be the second time now that Iran has bombed Israel. That has not ever occurred before this year, right? We are now 2 days from the first year mark of this conflict, the 1 year mark. And up until this point, right, Iran has now bombed Israel twice. Israel has responded a couple times with its own limited and punctuated bombing of Iran. Also, Iranian officials and Hezbollah officials have been targeted in Lebanon and Syria, outside of the immediate theater in Gaza. But these have been intermittent, isolated events, right? One fuselage of missiles fired, and then it's over. What I think worries anyone concerned about this conflict in terms of a broader war is the idea that this could potentially cascade out of control into a more open, constant war between Israel and Iran. The other term I'm using here in the title, a forever war, and there I'm really responding to the image on the left, which is an image of southern Lebanon after an Israeli bombardment, and I imagine you can see those are civilian structures, and so the question here, and when I say forever, I have in mind the time scale of the U.S. engagement in Afghanistan, right? 20 years of combat, huge amounts of blood and treasure lost, and that tends to be the American or right allied perspective on it. When we look at it from an Afghani perspective, hundreds of thousands of casualties, many of them, again, women, children, non combatants who end up in harm's way. And please note, after all of that, after 20 years of combat, we're basically right back where we started, which is to say the Taliban is in power again. And so the idea of a forever war is not literal, but it's a war that you don't know how you're going to end quickly once it begins, that you don't have clear criteria for success, or your criteria for success are clearly unattainable, that you don't have a clear-cut exit strategy. And the concern about the Israeli ground invasion of Lebanon, which was originally announced as being a limited and strategic invasion, but now appears to be growing, is that it will turn into a long-term occupation if Israel really is going to succeed in creating a buffer zone in the southern border regions, so that Hezbollah has less capacity to invade, less capacity to shoot missiles directly across the border, or else Israel will withdraw after however long it is, and then Hezbollah will return very quickly. So this is all of this to say, I think deeply concerning. Before I get into I will spend a minute on domestic politics. Obviously, we are now just a month away from a national election that has profound implications for our country, but also for our country's foreign policy. Give me one moment. There's a lot of noise coming in the window on my end, and nothing I can do about it because my window's already closed. Sorry. The idea that not only are there very high stakes in our election, but also that this election has very high stakes for the conflict in the Middle East. And there's a widespread belief that Donald Trump would do nothing to restrain Israel from widening this war. I'm not going to try to talk very much about that today, but it does seem to me that if the outcome of this election is that Donald Trump is the next president of the United States, Benjamin Netanyahu may have a complete green light from the United States, as well as a augmented supply of weapons with which to fight this war. So let me then turn to domestic politics proper just for a minute and note, of course, that there was a vice presidential debate. I'm sorry for the background noise. I hope it's not picking up too badly on the microphone. It should be done in just a minute. The vice presidential debate, from what the polls are showing, seems to have not done anything to fundamentally alter the dynamics in this race. I will talk about it for a minute from the other perspective, which I think is increasingly more important in trying to ascertain what's going to happen in this election, which is that of focus groups. And so when we look at the polls, that there's a marginal edge for J.D. Vance. He appeared to be more comfortable, more at ease, less nervous but also more fluent in his delivery, perhaps a little bit better in command of facts and policy issues than was Tim Walz. And that tends to influence people's judgment in these debates. But I think it's quite interesting to note that the focus groups that were created in order to get feedback from, in particular, undecided voters contradict. They have the opposite finding of the polls, which is that the undecided voters tended to think that Walz was the more credible of the two candidates and to come out inclined to like Walz more and perhaps support his ticket a little bit more. And there, I do think that the idea that Vance is dishonest, right? And that there were so many places where he doubled or multiplied the number of immigrants, the rate of inflation, the crime rate, etc., where it's very easy to fact check and to just see that what he's saying is not in fact accurate, and that the reason he was able to be smooth and nice and soften the edges, the reason that the Vance who turned up was not the Vance who's been the pit bull on the campaign trail or in the right-wing media ecosystem for several years now, is in part because he was dissembling, because he was distorting the record of Donald Trump in order to make it look less hostile to immigrants or less hostile to the Affordable Care Act than it was, in order to play down some of the aggressiveness that was so obvious in the first presidential debate. And to say all of that, Walz may have appeared more genuine in this debate. Very quickly, I do think that one of the things that was noteworthy in the focus groups, as well as in the debate as a whole, is that there was a really telling exchange in the 90th minute. So you had to watch close to the end of the debate to see this. It's also been reported on a lot since, right? Because Walz's response was one of the few very animated and confrontational moments in the debate. So please note, by the way, that the CBS News moderators, as far as I'm concerned, really let us down in this debate. They let us down by not fact checking, and they agreed in advance that they weren't going to fact check. And then at one point, they said something that Vance was saying wasn't true. And Vance said, "We agreed in advance that the rules would be that you wouldn't fact check me," as if professional journalists doing their job was intrinsically objectionable. All that to say, it fell to Walz to ask Vance if he believed Donald Trump had lost the 2020 election, with the clear implication, would he have certified the Electoral College outcome or not if he had been in Mike Pence's role on January 6th, 2021. And Vance refused to answer the question. Walz said that that was a damning non-answer, right? And it does appear that some undecided voters have focused on this. And just to be as clear as possible, that's in part because the Vice President of the United States has almost no constitutional duty as long as the president is alive, right? That is to say, their role is almost purely ceremonial, but the one of the critical duties they do have is to convene and preside over the Electoral College, gavel it in, gavel it out. And it appears that Vance is revealing that if 2028 comes round, he's the vice president of the United States, the Republicans lose, maybe he loses the presidential election, that he would not do what Mike Pence did if there is serious resistance to acknowledging that fact, that if it was in his advantage to do so, that he would throw it to Congress in order to change the outcome of the election. And to be as clear as possible, it's not just then him saying, I wouldn't perform the key constitutional duty, I wouldn't put Constitution and country over party and personal advantage. It's also an indication of how Trump 2024 is different from Trump 2016. That in 2016, he did feel the need to bring a mainstream Republican onto his ticket. And having done so, he then has Mike Pence, in a sense, at considerable risk to himself, standing between Donald Trump and a major constitutional crisis. And that in 2024, it's not just that the vice president of the United States will be at best a yes man for Donald Trump, and at worst, even more aggressive in pursuing Trump's agenda. It's also that Trump will no doubt populate his entire cabinet and administration with people who will be like J.D. Vance, unrestrained and incapable, unwilling to restrain Donald Trump's worst instincts. And so I do think that's worth noting. I'll say very quickly about the domestic implications of the war in the Middle East, as well as the aftermath of Hurricane Helene, which cut a vast swath of damage through 7 states. Incredible devastation to Western North Carolina in particular. But having said that, that this is perhaps the first time in the remarkable 2 months since Kamala Harris became the nominee for her party that external events have begun to intrude into our election cycle, and to do so in a way that could be damaging for Kamala Harris. I would point out, right, that there may be as much as 1% of the electorate in Michigan, 100,000 or more voters who will not vote for Harris because she will not say a word of criticism of Israel. And that if the election is as tight as it was in 2016 when Hillary Clinton lost Michigan by 10,000 votes, those 100,000 votes could very well decide the outcome of this election. And obviously, the war widening in the Middle East calls greater attention not only to the issue of the US's support for Israel, the unwillingness of Kamala Harris to even meet with the uncommitted faction of voters in Michigan and elsewhere, but also what I think of as one of the very few strong cards that Donald Trump has left to play. And please note, we got economic data again this week that suggests that this economy is incredibly strong, that inflation has really come under control, that interest rates are starting to come down. So the American Armageddon story that Donald Trump likes to spin in his rallies, I think is less convincing today than it was a year ago or 2 years ago. And by the way, the stronger the economy gets, the better people's individual economic situation ends up being, the more they have to risk in changing administrations, and in particular in allowing Donald Trump to pursue policies that I think many voters recognize are at least a little bit reckless in mass deportations and increasing tariffs and further tax cuts that will further increase the deficit. If we just focus very narrowly on Trump's economic policy, which I don't think is the strongest argument against him, but if you just focus on that, and people are beginning to feel like their economic situation is improving, and that policy agenda has risks associated with it, that favors Kamala Harris and maybe takes away one of Trump's strong suits. But having said that, the card that is left for him to play is, look, we were at peace when I was president, and that is because the world respected me, feared me. The United States stature and prestige was stronger. And by the way, Nicholas Kristof has an article in the New York Times today. I think it's absolutely right. Joe Biden has been absolutely impotent on this issue because he has been unwilling to leverage the provision of arms to Israel, unwilling to, for instance, invoke the Leahy Amendment, which says we cannot legally provide arms to a country that is engaged in war crimes or human rights abuses. I think it's quite clear if Biden were even to threaten that the State Department begin an investigation under the Leahy Amendment or other laws that restrict the way in which our arms could be used, he would immediately increase his leverage, but he didn't do that. And the result is that he has had zero impact on Benjamin Netanyahu's conduct of these wars. Donald Trump has a point when he says that he might be a little bit more feared, a little bit more reckless, a little bit more willing to use leverage. And I don't think it follows from that that the world would be a more peaceful place for Donald Trump president, but it does at least create a sense that we might be better off in the world today if we didn't have a continuation of the Trump foreign policy. I'll skip this last point because I do want to have time to really spend some time with you on the Middle East. I will just point out to you, right, if you're comparing this slide with the similar slide from last week, it will look nearly identical. It is updated, but frankly, there's really no movement in the polls or in the models. This is very, very tight. Harris has a slight advantage, but please note, right, the advantage is small enough that the margin of error within the polls, any kind of flaw in the polls, any kind of movement in Trump's direction could quickly alter the prediction and the outcome of this election. This is a very, very tight election. So, having said all of that, I will just say the good economic news, a rapid, competent response from FEMA to what happened with Hurricane Helena. Um, there are opportunities for Harris as well as liabilities in the current news. Let's get to the Middle East. And I'm going to start with just basic information and then try to provide some analysis as well, beginning with the three big events of the last week. The first is that Israel, now a week ago, assassinated Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, through a bomb strike in Beirut. By the way, not just him, but a couple other members of the leadership council of Hezbollah, effectively decapitating Hezbollah. And then, right, just 4 days ago, Israel launched a ground invasion in Lebanon. I'll show this in a little bit more detail, maybe in a moment. But as you can see, those are places that are under evacuation orders from Israel. This is the region south of the Litani River that the UN, by decree, declared as a buffer zone and is not supposed to have any Hezbollah presence, and yet Hezbollah is very much tunneling, setting up missile firing zones present in this region. And it appears that the objective of the campaign in Lebanon is, on the one hand, to seriously degrade Hezbollah's capacity to strike into Israel, and on the other hand, to force Hezbollah north of the Litani River. As you can see, this is the Awali River, further north still. By the way, Lebanon is tiny, not much bigger than Manhattan, 5 million people in it. These distances aren't that great, But what Israel is asking is that everybody from this region relocate, everybody who's a civilian and non-combatant. And of course, the thing to remember is Lebanon is very close to being a failed state. It does not have great governmental capacity. It does not have a lot of wealth. A lot of the people in this region are poor, are elderly, are young, are going to have a hard time complying with the Israeli order. And so it's one thing to forewarn, but it's another thing to then attack knowing that the civilian population has been unable to decamp and relocate. Um, the other map shows you the third major event from the last week, which is the Iranian missile strike on Israel. Very briefly, Iran fired roughly 180 missiles into Israel on Tuesday night. And those missiles, to be as clear as possible, were ballistic missiles. Those are missiles that go up into the stratosphere and then fall at several times the speed of sound. They're much more difficult to intercept, right? So Israel has its well-known Iron Dome missile protection system, but that's really for missiles that are launched from the ground that do not have a ballistic trajectory, that do not hit those kinds of speeds. And by the way, the Iranian missiles appear to be quite sophisticated. They appear to have the capacity to move in their descent in order to evade interceptors. And so Israel did fire intercepting missiles, as did the United States, from ships in the region, anti-missile carriers that were there for precisely this purpose. But it appears roughly 20 of the 180 missiles did get to or near their targets. They hit two military bases and close to the headquarters of the Mossad. I think two things to notice about this. One of them is that this makes it much more likely that Israel is going to retaliate because the missiles actually did do damage on the ground, and perhaps retaliate in a disproportionate way. I think that's the fundamental question we have to ask. Of course, there's no clear measure of proportionality. But having said that, one of the questions is going to be whether Israel will, in a sense, deliberately challenge Iran to further escalate this war by launching a attack that exceeds any clear metric of proportionality. If, for instance, Israel attacks Iran's nuclear facilities. And to be as clear as possible, there's very good reasons to not want Iran to have nuclear weapons. The question is whether a military attack on those facilities risks a much broader war. And the kind of war that isn't occasional attacks that then stop as soon as they have accomplished their purpose, but a more long-term shooting campaign between the two countries. When we look to try to predict what's going to happen in this conflict, it's useful to think about the decision makers. And it appears that Masoud Pezeshkian, the president of Iran, relatively new president, just elected in July, was really not involved in planning or ordering this attack. That this attack was ordered by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which is not really integrated into the government. It is part of the theocratic regime headed ultimately by the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And the fact appears to be that the president wasn't told about this attack until about an hour before it was launched. And that then opens up all kinds of issues about where the Iranian regime's thinking is on this, question of whether or not a broader conflict is being sought. I don't think Iran wants a broader conflict at the moment. Not that I'm an Iran scholar or have lots of good information about this, but remember that up until October 7th, Iran was in the middle of a year-long series of sustained protests, particularly by urban younger people, people who've grown up entirely post the 1979 religion in an Orthodox Islamic state that is particularly repressive of women, and that girls and women were protesting against some of the policing of their attire and their etiquette. They want to be part of the modern world, and this, although it was ultimately mainly successfully put down by the Iranian regime, does indicate that there is widespread discontent among younger people, especially in urban areas with the regime. It's not a good moment for the regime, perhaps, to be in a damaging conflict with Israel. We have, of course, Benjamin Netanyahu, the the leader of Israel, right, the prime minister, and we have President Joe Biden. And I will point out, as I already have, right, that Biden appears to be really completely sidelined and marginal. That the fact that the United States is arming and protecting Israel is not something 1 month from a national election that Joe Biden is willing to use as leverage for fear that he might actually um, im- uh, alter the current dynamic in Donald Trump's favor if he were to appear to be critical of Israel. And of course, Netanyahu recognizes this and recognizes the opening that this presents for him, and also recognizes that Kamala Harris is an unknown quantity to him. And while she certainly has not said anything critical of Israel or indicated in any way, well, I shouldn't say anything, right? She obviously has expressed more forcefully and directly than Joe Biden has some concern for the level of civilian casualties in Gaza. But having said that, she hasn't indicated in any way that she would change American foreign policy. But the worry for Benjamin Netanyahu has to be that she might, and that the American law is pretty clear. If our weapons are being used for human rights violations or war crimes, we are not supposed to send them. And if the State Department were to do an investigation, it seems pretty clear that they would conclude that, in fact, our weapons are being used in prohibited ways, and the result might be that we would have to cut off Israel's supply of at least some of those weapons. And so Netanyahu, I think, sees an opportunity right now. And by the way, I think it's quite clear that he prefers Donald Trump. He doesn't think that Donald Trump has the strategic compass to really be concerned about broader issues of regional or global security, that Trump is someone who divides the world into friends and enemies and thinks of Israel and Netanyahu particularly as a friend, and therefore will allow him to do more or less whatever he wants to do in the region. And the fact of escalating warfare in the Middle East may very well help to put someone who is going to be more favorable to his interests in the White House, I imagine, isn't the chief concern in Netanyahu's calculation about going into Lebanon, but probably is not absent from his calculus either. All right, so just a little bit more background information before we shift into analysis. And here I would point out, right, we are dealing with very small numbers. Israel's population is about the population of New York City. Please note that of that population, only roughly 7 million of Israeli citizens are in fact, Jews, right? And so we've got a substantial Arab minority. There is the West Bank then that is dominantly Palestinian, although there are now hundreds of thousands of Jewish settlers in the West Bank as well. Roughly 3 million people, mostly Palestinian. Gaza, 2 million people, almost exclusively Palestinian. Lebanon, smaller still, almost half the size. And by the way, geographically, we're talking about an area the size of Delaware with regards to Israel, the size of Manhattan with regards to Lebanon. Hezbollah has 100,000 fighters, but 150,000 missiles, at least before the Israeli bombardment started. That's how many it had. And then please note, we can go back to the previous diagram, right? Iran completely dwarfs the size of this region where the conflict has been concentrated up until this point. Iran is one of the most populous, one of the largest, one of the most oil-rich countries in the region, and by the way, one of the most militarily capable, best armed countries in the region. If Iran and Israel tilt into warfare, I don't think either of them wants this, but this completely changes the dynamic. It is now a war between two of the best armed and potentially most lethal militaries in the world. One last little bit of context or background information here, right? These are areas in Beirut that Israel has struck over the last few days. And please note, right, that the theater of operation really is southern Lebanon. Beirut is, right, north and west in Lebanon, but because Hezbollah also has offices and headquarters, in particular in the Dahaya suburb of Beirut, Israel is also striking there. The Israelis have succeeded. The Hezbollah has announced, and Israeli intelligence has confirmed, in killing Hassan Nasrallah, Fouad Shukr, Ibrahim Akil, four of the leaders of Hezbollah. They targeted 2 days ago Hashim Safieddine, who is likely the successor to Hassan Nasrallah. It's not yet clear whether they were successful in bombing the place where Safieddine was meeting. But it is clear that Hezbollah is substantially diminished in terms of its leadership core by the Israeli strikes. So that's the immediate context. I now want to go into a little bit more historical context and finally offer you some analysis of why I think this is such a tragic, such an awful, such a scary area for conflict, and why, unfortunately, the prospects for reconciliation or peace are so bleak at the moment. So Iran is, as I've noted already, internally divided, right? And the public elected a moderate, a relatively moderate president, in part in expressing their dissatisfaction with the extremism of the theocratic regime that is ruling them. It is also the case that Iran is economically diminished by international sanctions, but that the fact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the growing alliance between Russia and Iran. Remember, Iran has been supplying large numbers of drones that have been very important to Russia's military campaign in Ukraine to Russia. The growing cooperation between Iran and North Korea, with North Korea providing them some of the technical know-how that they need in their nuclear weapons development program. That this is allowing Iran to sell its oil as well, to figure out avenues to market for its oil supply, and hence allowing the regime to have the capacity to support Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis. And I do think, and I'll just maybe jump ahead for a second, Thomas Friedman, in a recent article in the Times, had, I think, a pretty good framework for thinking about the increasing division of the world into a coalition of inclusion, where inclusion refers to inclusion in the global economy under the rules created by international institutions that are primarily dominated by the West, by the United States and Europe, and on the other hand, a coalition of reaction that doesn't like the rules of that game or the power that goes to the countries that are setting the rules of the game when inclusion or integration into the global economy is the guiding architecture of international relations. And so this coalition of reaction includes Iran, includes Ukraine, both of whom, I'm sorry, includes Russia, not Ukraine, both of whom are trying to prevent, in the case of Iran, Israel and the Saudis from normalizing their relations, and in so doing, then integrating and including more of the Middle East in European and global trade. And on the other hand, right, Russia trying to prevent Ukraine pivoting to the West and doing the same thing in its region. So Iran clearly has some allies, has some resources, has some wealth, has some proxies. Those proxies continuously harry Israel. Israel is now striking back at all three of them, has substantially degraded the capacity of Hamas, is in the process of trying to do the same thing to Hezbollah. This ultimately weakens Iran as a regional actor. I think it's one of the reasons we need to be worried that Iran could decide that it's in its interest to escalate this war. Second big historical factor here, or thing that we need to understand, is going back to the Second Intifada, the movement of Palestinians to resist Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. The Intifada, the uprising for resistance, first took the form, the first Intifada, of stone throwing, right? Of boys primarily throwing stones against Israeli soldiers and tempting them to use military force, bullets in response to stones. The second Intifada is the Intifada of suicide bombers, right? Of men primarily strapping explosives, plastique, to their chests and going onto buses, into cafes, into restaurants. And remember, Israel is really small, small in terms of population, small in terms of territory, and the pervasive sense of insecurity, the idea that when you said goodbye to your spouse as you went off to work, as you said goodbye to your children as you sent them to school, didn't know whether you were sending them off into a safe world or possibly not going to see them at the end of the day. That this occurred in the context in which, right, Israel had withdrawn its military troops from Gaza, had participated in the Oslo Accords. From the Israeli perspective, they were on their way to trying to give greater autonomy, maybe even a state, to the Palestinians, and the Palestinians greeted them not with some greater recognition and reconciliation, but with deadly, indiscriminate, terroristic force directed at civilians. And the result was deep, fundamental shifts in Israeli public opinion and politics. The Labor Party, which had been the dominant party of Israel for its first 60 years of existence, has been completely completely marginalized in Israeli politics. The choice now is between different right-wing parties and not any longer between a meaningful constituency for peace and reconciliation with the Palestinians within Israel. Um, Sorry, one more thing then to point out, right, is that Israel now has the most far right government in its history, that it continues to build settlements in the West Bank, that the result is a growing sense among the Palestinians that their uh, occupier is also trying ultimately to eliminate them from their ancestral homeland, to force them out. By the way, depending upon which figures you look at, in Gaza, somewhere between 6 and 11,000 children have been killed in the last year. And this is the highest rate of child mortality in any international conflict in the world in the last 20 years, according to Oxfam. I think again, you've got to recognize from a Palestinian, from Muslim, from an Arab perspective, this is barbaric warfare. I think from a humanitarian perspective, this is a clear violation of rules of war that require that you minimize civilian casualties. The Israeli military has not conducted itself in that way, in part because of the makeup of the coalition in this government, and the fact that at least several of the ministers have openly called for a second Nakba, for expanding Israel by depopulating the areas that are under international law still Palestinian territory. Let me, because I'm running low on time, talk less about Netanyahu's strategy very quickly, pursuing recognition from the Saudis, from other regimes in the area that are primarily autocratic regimes. And that matters, right? Because this is recognition from the top, from the power structure of the state, which does not necessarily confer legitimacy unto Israel with average Arabs or Muslims in the region and throughout the world. And so it's a realpolitik strategy, right? It's a strategy that says, yes, we were more threatened by hostile states than we are by hostile people, than we are by the Arab street. But ultimately, regimes respond to their need to shore up their power, their legitimacy, and that makes them susceptible to pressure from their people. The deeper background to this, of course, is that Israel and the Saudis were pursuing reconciliation, and that deeply threatened the Iranians with the idea that there might be a more integrated Middle East, less pressure on Israel. And so let me stop there with the background. That there's one more piece of analysis in the last few minutes I want to share with you, and then of course open it to discussion as well. And just to point out, whether we're talking about the Israeli campaign in Gaza against Hamas, the Israeli campaign in Lebanon against Hezbollah, the Iranian attack on Israel, the Israeli retaliation, which is still forthcoming, I don't see this as anything but a cycle of vengeance and further revenge that continues to escalate. Neither side in any of these conflicts has a good way out, a way that represents complete victory for them or some sort of sufficient win to allow them to save face and walk away. And both sides are increasingly failing to recognize the humanity of the other. Maybe this is not even increasingly, maybe this is just the context of the Middle East. Um, and right, I do think one of the things that Netanyahu is trying to do, in addition to bolstering his own standing in Israeli society, and please note that Netanyahu now has recovered in terms of probably, if there's an election today, he's got a pretty good chance of winning because of the way in which he has conducted these campaigns. But having said that, the I think fundamental effort here is not only to put October 7th far enough behind him that it's not the most salient, the most important political event when he stands for reelection, but also to reassert the asymmetrical dominance of the Israeli military and security forces. And that's part of what taking out Nasrallah does, right? It says we are back on top. And even though we failed to protect our society and our civilians on October 7th, we have regained initiative. And so the idea that maybe one response to the failure on October 7th would be to say military means alone never guarantee long-term security, and that what we need is a more political solution, that did not, in fact, enter the calculus, was not the path taken. And so we're back into trying to use military means to ultimately address diplomatic and strategic issues. I do think that there are limits on this, that long term this will be counterproductive, that the literature is very clear. As long as there are substantial civilian casualties, and it's very hard to fight non-state actors who hide among civilians, who deliberately tempt Israel to attack schools and hospitals and mosques by hiding there, by locating their facilities and the immediate environment thereof, that when you kill civilians, you are also, in essence, serving to recruit new members to these organizations, right? And so, in that sense, I do suspect long term Hezbollah, Hamas emerge stronger, not weaker, or their successor organizations are even more radical and adamant in their demand that Israel not exist, as opposed to that there be some sort of reconciliation, some sort of long-term political solution. And that leads me then to the final thing I want to say, and I think the most fundamental thing I want to say, which is that pursuing mutual recognition involves being able to see the humanity of your former adversary, right? And that requires that there be some mutual understanding, some mutual trust, some grudging respect, maybe a third party able to broker some kind of de-escalation of your conflict in eventual terms, and then the very difficult long-term process, right, which may take decades, of stabilizing that arrangement. And I just am deeply, deeply worried that those conditions don't exist. There is no broker, but even more importantly, the misunderstanding and mistrust between the two sides has grown so deep, so pervasive, the dehumanization so thorough that it's going to take a very long time for the consequences, the moral consequences of what's happened over the last year to recede and allow for future reconciliation. So let me just underline two perspectives. One perspective, on the one hand, sees Jewish Israelis as colonists, sees the project of a Jewish democracy in Israel as a fundamentally colonial project. And so think here of the Algerians in northern Africa and the way in which they regarded the French. The French were settler colonists for the most part, right? They didn't come in the way that the British did to India, for instance, for 5 years at a time. They moved, they built homes, they raised children, their children stayed, uh, sometimes across multiple generations. 100 years, 150 years, the French had been in northern Africa, but nevertheless, the Algerians did not view them as indigenous to the region. They viewed them as European colonists who, as a result of occupying their territory, had fundamentally subjugated and oppressed them, taken their resources, created conditions of poverty and unfreedom for them, and therefore the solution had to be that the French had to go back to France. Right? And this is essentially the Iranian, the Hamas, the Hezbollah perspective on Israel. This is a colonial enterprise. It needs to be eradicated. But of course, from the Jewish, from the Israeli perspective, from the perspective of the friends of Israel, the Israelis are indigenous to the region, right? They have a very clear historical presence in the region going back millennia, and they have been there in terms of Zionism for roughly 150 years now. And by the way, unlike the French in Algeria, they don't have any other place to go in the world. And of course, Israel was created in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And it makes it so clear from the Israeli Jewish perspective that if there isn't a Jewish state, the Jews are deeply vulnerable to persecution or even eradication, right? And so on the one hand, deep divide, right? Very hard to reconcile those two perspectives. But then let me point out further that when Israel slaughters its neighbors with reckless impunity in the way that it has done in Gaza, right? Basically, really not taking into account civilian casualties as a major factor in their war planning, or when they seize the land and resources of the territory they currently occupy but cannot legally claim to be part of their state, as they're doing in the West Bank, then they really do appear to be neo-colonial. That's their attitude and their apparent status. They are not treating their neighbors as neighbors. They're not treating them as equal. They're not taking into account their humanity. They are, as was for far too long the case in European colonialism, simply doing whatever they want to do as a result of their superior force and strength. Turning now to this other side of the equation. Are Hamas and Hezbollah, we could add the Houthis to this as well, simply Iranian proxies who are detested or despised within their own societies, who the only reason they exist is to try to eradicate Israel, to bring terror to bear on the Israeli Jewish population? Or alternatively, are they resilient, socially embedded, military, political, cultural, religious, social organizations that have their own constituency? And here also, I want to say there's not, to either of these sets of questions, a clear cut, factual answer, a way of establishing a historical truth that is so compelling that both sides have to acknowledge it, right? It is the case that these are interpretive lenses that are incompatible, but that if you're seeking to confirm your conclusion, there's enough evidence for both sides to conclude the Israelis are colonists, the members of Hamas are merely terrorists, and therefore there's no reason to do anything but to seek to eliminate the other side. And that unfortunately, the dynamics of the last year have deepened that fundamental hostility and mistrust. And we, those of us who care about peace, about reconciliation, about 6,000 to 11,000 children dying in a year, have to recognize that the current course of action not only leads to ongoing war and hostility, potentially escalating and protracted, more and more deaths, it also diminishes the prospects for any kind of meaningful peace in the region. And that has to change. Our policy has to be calibrated to prevent this ongoing dehumanization from further making peace impossible. That is where I'll stop for today. Not a happy note, I recognize, but nevertheless, I do think it's, in a sense, hard to resist some of these conclusions. Let me open it up for discussion. Who wants to start us out with a thought or a comment today? One of my Jewish friends with relatives in Israel says for years now there hasn't been a religious holiday without a war, right, or without some kind of attack or battle. It certainly is a peculiar moment in which to be marking the beginning of the new year. Uh, do I see somebody with their hand up? No, I thought I did for a second, but I think I was misreading. No comments, no thoughts. Too dark, too depressing today. Well, I'm sorry to leave you in that place. So, David, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say your thoughts have left me speechless.
Yeah, so not quite speechless because you can articulate it, but yes, and that final idea. I mean, and I was reading, right. My old colleague and friend Fawaz Gurgis, who has a new book out about democracy promotion in the Middle East, who teaches at the London School of Economics, and then Thomas Friedman and other people who are, for what it's worth, Gurgis is Lebanese and Christian, but has a lot of sympathy for his Lebanese compatriots and relatives, and who is very critical of Israel. And then Friedman, who is obviously critical of Israel, but also even more critical of Iran. And just thinking, how can these two people reach such diametrically opposed conclusions? And it led me to this conclusion, it's because the situation supports both interpretations.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
that is truly awful, to be able to think of the Israeli Jews as colonists or indigenous in the same breath, to be able to think of Hezbollah as a social welfare organization and political party and a terrorist organization in the same breath. But the situation supports those deeply ambivalent conclusions.
Isn't there an old saying about a pox on both your houses? I can't remember exactly where it comes from, but sort
Yeah.
of my conclusion.
So I'm not positive. I think it might be Shakespeare. I think it might be Romeo and Juliet. But having said that, um, I don't want a pox on both these houses. Quite the contrary. I
Exactly.
want the children to stop being killed. I want reconciliation. I'm not so. Uh, much mired in fantasy that I think a single state solution, although it's clearly the most just solution, has any plausibility at this point. But God help us, a two-state solution, some effort to allow the Palestinians autonomy and freedom and self-determination, and for the Israelis to have some lasting security without engaging in the kind of brutalization of innocence that the very state was founded to prevent. It's just we've got to get past this.
David,
Yeah,
David,
go ahead,
can
Iris,
you hear
please.
me?
Yes, I can.
I was traveling, excuse me, I was traveling in Europe a few years ago and met a whole group of young Israeli students. And they were so fed up because, hey, we gave them back Gaza. What did they do? Nothing. And the truth is that the Israeli government at that time did not seek a solution to their frustration in Gaza. They sought to ally with both sides against peace. They said, well, we don't have a peace partner, so we can't do anything about it. It's hopeless in Gaza. Whereas they could have aligned themselves with peacemakers in Gaza, there were people who wanted to have a constructive dialogue along the lines of what can we do together. The Israeli government never really tried to work with a moderate Palestinian group. So they supported that awful PA that was being led by Hamas, I think.
Abbas, yeah.
And then again, in Gaza, they played a double nasty game of not letting anybody see hope for the future. And now we're led to young people believing, well, we tried it, it didn't work. So why even bother anymore? Just bomb the hell out of them and get them out of the country. It's never going to work that way. There are, if you believe Thomas Friedman, there are groups that definitely want conciliation and cohabitation with a two-state solution. You know, Israel, under its current administration, will not tolerate such a thing. But what I do not understand, and maybe you or someone can explain it, is why have the voters of Israel not supported moderate governments? They kept folding one after another until the only group that Netanyahu could count on were these ultra messianic religious crazies who do not want any association with Arabs whatsoever, that they cannot control. So that's my question. Where are sensible Israelis? They parade like crazy on the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, but where are they when they vote?
And so I am not going to be able to fully answer your question today, Iris, but I'll go a little ways if I can. I'll start with the first half of your comment, which is that, and I'll be a little bit more specific, that Israel, and I think we have to be careful here to specify Benjamin Netanyahu, who has been the dominant figure in Israeli politics for coming up on 15 years now, who's led multiple governments, has not had an interest in having a Palestinian partner, has actually quite the opposite, had an interest in being able to say, there is nobody for us to negotiate with, and so we're not going to negotiate, right? And that part of the way in which he did that was by undermining the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, and the uh, right, more moderate form of Palestinian government, especially in the West Bank, and did so in order to discredit and humiliate them in the eyes of Palestinians, to make them appear a mere Israeli puppet regime, while at the same time be as clear as possible about this. Netanyahu and his government deliberately allowed for a lot of money to be funneled into Hamas in order to make Hamas appear to be the more credible representative of the
Right.
Palestinians. And knowing that Hamas's stated position and its leader in particular were adamant about not negotiating with Israel because they want to eradicate Israel. So that's Netanyahu. And then I think you have to admit, right, that personalities matter in politics, and that Netanyahu has been the most successful, most strategic, most cunning politician in Israel of his generation. Also, in many ways, very charismatic, but he's also apparently always one or two steps ahead of everybody else in Israeli politics, playing the long game, thinking about the next coalition, the next election, the next crisis, and how to turn it to his advantage. And in a parliamentary system with proportionate representation that overrepresents smaller groups, and with a growing movement of Jewish fundamentalists and Jewish supremacists who believe in right biblical Israel, Jewish supremacy over the original biblical borders of Israel, despite what international law says. We have religious law, and religious law trumps international law. We should possess greater Israel. And those parties have grown in strength, and Netanyahu has been pushed more and more in the direction of relying on those parties to form a coalition government. By the way, don't neglect that if Netanyahu is not in power, Netanyahu is in court facing criminal prosecution, right? So he is fighting for his life and his freedom, and taking Israel where he needs it to go in order to be able to stay in power. But having said all of that, I think what you started with, Iris, right? You know, the Israelis, the young people you met when you were on vacation who said, look, we gave them Gaza and they repay us by sending suicide bombers onto our buses and into our cafes, right? We gave them Gaza and they repay us by electing Hamas. I think that's a oversimplified story, right? Because it neglects the whole Netanyahu side of the story. But having said that, it deeply discredited labor and the Israeli left and the Israeli peace constituency. They are still there. They now get around 10% of the vote in elections. But yes, I do think that the uh, Israelis who are turning out to march in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem to protest the reforms of the judiciary to disempower it so the settlers in the West Bank can violate law with impunity, can seize territory without constraint. They are not protesting in favor of peace. They're protesting in favor of maintaining Israeli democracy and rule of law. And there's a big difference. There's just not a peace constituency in Israel right now because they do not see the humanity of their opponents. They do not see in the Palestinians anything but enemies. And this is the fundamental problem in this conflict. If you don't see that you got somebody you can trust, somebody you can work with, someone you acknowledge as being equal to you and having a standing in this conflict and having meaningful human interests alongside your own, then you're going to drop bombs on
David, are you saying that all those protests in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv were supportive of Netanyahu? I thought it was the opposite. They were
Yeah.
not
But
happy
what?
with
No,
Netanyahu.
absolutely not. But what are they protesting that Netanyahu is doing? Judicial reform, right? Constraining the ability of the courts to impose the rule of law on the settlers. They're not, and by the way, please note that I think if an election would have been held on October 5th, a year ago, Netanyahu would have lost power. Right.
Yes,
But
yes.
but but having said that, um, an election wasn't held on October 5th, and the reason Netanyahu would have lost power on October 5th is because of the judicial reforms, not because of the support for Hamas, not because of the unwillingness to negotiate with the Palestinian Authority. The reason that they disliked Netanyahu was due to domestic politics, not due to the issue with the Palestinians, the international issue. And so having said all of that, Iris, then note that of course there wasn't an election on October 5th, and so on October 7th there was a Hamas invasion, and then there has been this protracted war. And please note that a lot of Israelis are very critical of the way in which Netanyahu and the IDF have conducted the war, the failure to bring the hostages home. And by the way, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, in the sense that there's no real exit strategy from
Oh,
Gaza that doesn't leave Hamas uh, sufficiently intact to be able to recover. The same thing will be true in Lebanon and Hezbollah. And so short term military victory is not the same as long term security. And I just think that ultimately, maybe Netanyahu is a little bit discredited by that. Maybe somebody else comes to power. But if it's Benny Gantz, he's not in favor of negotiating peace with the Palestinians. He just is a little bit more moderate in his militarism than is Netanyahu.
thank you.
Yeah, of course, Iris. I'm sorry. I wish I had a different answer. All right, everybody. We've gone on for an hour and 25 minutes. It's dark stuff. Why don't we call it a day? I'll say Shana Tova to those of you who that's meaningful to. I'll wish you good weeks. Happy New Year to those of you who celebrate. And then I will see you next week. And who
Can
knows?
I just say
I suspect
something?
we'll be back to talking about domestic politics again. Take
Bye-bye.
care, everyone. Be well. Thank you.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
look forward to seeing you next week. Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you, David.
My
Thank you,
pleasure.
Dave.
Thank you. Bye bye.